table looks. It's got the date of the incident, it's got the person's name, it's got how they were killed. These are shootings, so part of what's not complete about the table is that stuff like George Floyd and Eric Garner wouldn't have been counted because they weren't shot. Got the age, gender, race, what city. Then they've got some other indicators here. Signs of mental illness, threat level, fleeing, and whether there's a body camera. So there's a lot of stuff you could dig into here if you were kind of interested in this situation that's kind of unique to our country. But what I was interested in was the disaggregation by race. So I took it and I split it up and used Excel to help me do the counting. And that's where I came up with these two tables. So the question I asked in the warm-up was, what do you notice? And how have the numbers changed? Because that's where we're headed in this section. We're talking about absolute and relative change. So the question is, how have the numbers changed? I haven't given you any mathematical tools for that, but to talk about change, we don't need special math tools because change is something that we are familiar with. We can talk about it qualitatively if we want to. So anything that you notice in these tables about change? What did you say when to answer how have the numbers changed?
I mean, to me, it just seems like they're going up and down. I mean, one year's
Give me an
up,
example.
like for white in 2015, you got 498. Then it goes down in 16, then goes down in 17, goes down in 18. So it's like they're fluctuating.
Okay. Well, actually, what you just noticed as you went through it is that it went down every year for white people getting shot by the police. But maybe what you're saying fluctuating is the change is not consistent. Like the first 2015 to 2016 went down 30, then it went down 9, then it went down 5, and now it's gone down 50. Although do notice, and this one of the things I like about real data is it kind of reminds you about some of the complexities. There's 143 people in 2019 that have yet to be identified in terms of their race. That's a much higher number, and that's because it's more recent. So it takes time for them to like sort back through and figure out, well, there was a story about a guy who was shot, but I don't know whether he was white or black. There's no pictures or there's no mention of it in the article. So that could account for some of the drop here, but we're not sure about this. But you're right that there's fluctuation. I mean, take another category, Native American. That one does go up and down, right? 9, 16, 22, 15, 13. So it goes up and then it comes back down. So
Right.
fluctuation is probably a pretty good word. That there's not a trend up or down. It kind of, if we look across all of these different categories, we see both things happening. Some of them are going up, some of them are going down. Okay, that's a good observation. What else do you notice? If you look at the total line at the bottom of the first table,
Yeah, they not too far from each other. They really close.
pretty consistent, right?
Yeah.
Which is kind of a weird thing and also kind of a sad thing, right? They're killing about 1,000 people a year. Now we're not. I'm not trying to judge the police. Some of this, when you read these stories, these are actually suicide by police. But people who are feeling terrible about something call the police, have an interaction where they basically force the police to shoot them by picking up a gun and threatening, and then the police are like, no, but I was reading one article to try to figure out the race to help the Washington Post and give them some information. And basically he put down the gun at one point and then he picked it back up and the police shot him because they had told him to put it down and he was picking it up and pointing it at the officers. And that's just kind of a weird feature of our society. We have lots of guns in our society, but it's probably easier to have somebody shoot you than to shoot yourself. If you're feeling depressed, that's a way that you can end your life, and that's really terribly sad. But that's, you know, what percent of the shootings are accountable for that? I don't know. But anyways, yes, the general observation that these numbers don't change a lot is a fair observation. Now, just to get us back to quantitative reasoning, that's a qualitative statement. That is, we're not using numbers, right? But we could use numbers to support what we're saying, and that's where this absolute and relative change is going to be helpful. So let's just take that top line and kind of think about the definitions in chapter 7 that we're going to be talking about. So I'm going to bring these over into Excel. Okay, so absolute change is just finding the difference. So for instance, if I want the absolute change from 2015 to 2016, I'm just finding out how much did it change by. Now, if it increased, I'm going to report a positive number, and if it decreased, I'm going to report a negative number. And the way the formula does that is by taking the new value and subtracting the old value. So what would the absolute change be if we're just thinking about the total number of people shot by police from 2015 to 2016?
It would be minus 32.
Minus 32. Okay, you guys get that?
Yeah.
That's new minus old. So I take the 962 and I subtract the 994, and it ends up as a negative number. The negative means it was a decrease of 32 shootings. Okay. 2016 to 2017. This is a positive number. Why is it a positive number?
Because it increased.
Because it increased, right? So I want you to keep that in the back of your mind, that the negative and the positive here are significant. We don't do a lot of random work with negative numbers, but this is a situation where the negative has a meaning in the context. Okay, so that's absolute change. Now, you know, an increase of 24, a decrease of 32, those may or may not be significant. And this is where relative change is important. If there was only one person killed and then all of a sudden there were 33 people killed, that's a huge change. But if there were already 994 people killed and now all of a sudden there's only 962 people killed, you're looking at that and you're thinking, well, that's not that much of a change. And the relative change is a way we can express that and communicate that, right? So if you look at the formula in the book, I think this is, so we start this on, well, I'm not sure what page it's on, but around page 71. Tells you how to do the absolute change here, and then it tells you how to do the relative change here. So if you notice, the top is very similar to, in fact, it's exactly the same as the absolute change. So I'm going to write this in two ways. So for the relative change, you can do new minus old divided by old. That's one option. Or you can do absolute change, which I'll call AC, and you divide it by the old value. So those are two different ways to get the relative change. Okay, so let's do the relative change for the same years we just did the absolute change, 2015 to 2016 and 2016 to 2017. If you're going to use new minus old divided by old, just be careful to finish the subtraction before you divide. Because, for instance, if I do new minus old divided by old, that's going to give me a crazy answer. Well, you maybe don't know it's crazy yet, but it is a crazy answer. What I need to do is finish the subtraction before I divide. So that's the relative change. It's a crazy negative decimal. Why is it a negative decimal? Because another way to think about it is the absolute change, which was negative 32, and then we're dividing that by where we started, which is 994. So the reason it's negative is because one of these numbers is negative and one of them is positive. Go ahead, Roger.
My question was, do you want us to write out the entire decimal number?
No.
Okay.
In fact, I don't want you to stop here. This is essentially, we can think of it as a part to whole ratio. because we're losing some quantity out of the original quantity that we had. And so I would write this as a percentage, like this. And from that perspective, 0 or 1 decimal places is fine. It's more than enough. 3%, 3.2%, -3%, -3.2%. Those are the answers that I would expect you to write here for relative change. 1 or 2 decimals on the percentage. Okay, so using parentheses, new minus old divided by old. Should have got this number. Or of course I could take the absolute change and just divide it by where I started in 2016. That's my old number. And that gives me the same thing. So rounding it and turning it into a decimal, 2 or 2.5%, those are both good answers. Okay, any questions about how to calculate the absolute change and the relative change? And these numbers are small percentages. That's why, that's the quantitative backup for what we were feeling about the numbers, that they weren't changing that much, right? And if we look at some of these other ones, they change even less. I mean, the 32 and the 24 were relatively big increases compared to 2017, 2018, and 2018, 2019. So the percentages would be even smaller. So one of the things about change, talking about change, if we're going to quantify, we've got 2 options. We can talk about how it changed absolutely. We can talk about how it changed relative to where it started. And both of those can be helpful ways of talking about change. So they're both good for your toolbox. When we talk about relative change, I encourage you to move it into the percentage because people can make sense of that easier than hearing some kind of crazy decimal. Okay, so let's take a look at, this is a really good activity, but let's take a look at this page, page 74. So I don't know if you're aware, but if you're renting a place, the Department of Housing and Urban Development has gone around the country, especially in urban areas, and they've looked at rental prices and they've determined what fair market rental is for the zip code that you're in. So these are kind of old now. 2000 is 20 years old, 2015 is 5 years old. So we could go to HUD's website and we can pull up their fair market rental. So we could do something that's a little more applicable to us in our time. 2020, here we go. Check here for 2020 FMRs. And clearly for Gary area. So it gives us a breakdown based on the apartment and our zip code. It gives us the fair market rental based on the work that HUD did. And I think what HUD does is they just go around and they kind of collect a bunch of data points to see what people are charging in the 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, 3 bedroom range. And that's how they come up with their fair market rental. So does somebody want to give me a zip code that's meaningful to them? 46410, we've got a bunch of different rental prices, right? We can look around and we can see relative to the other ones, is it higher or lower? I do want to get to that kind of problem. But we also might be interested in kind of the historical value. So let's just copy this data here, and then I'm going to go back and look at 2019 and see what the change was. So this is 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, 3 bedroom, 4 bedroom, and the first one would be like a studio or an efficiency apartment. They call it efficiency. So let's back it up and let's go to 2019 because that was one of our options here. And we'll go back to Gary and we'll just do a quick problem on this. There we go. Okay, so sticking with 46, is it 410 or 310, right?
410.
Oh, 410, sorry. Right here, okay. So we'll take this number, 2020. Okay. So let's just answer a question like, what is the absolute and relative change for a 2-bedroom apartment in 46410 from 2019 to 2020? Okay, so to do this problem, you're just gonna do those basic calculations, but the challenge is you've got to pull out all the numbers that you need using the table. So you've got the size of the apartment across the top, you've got the year on the side here, and these are your actual rental prices. And remember, you're going to do new minus old for absolute and new minus old divided by old for relative. Okay, so go ahead and see if you can calculate both numbers, absolute change and the relative change. And then I want you to, if you're finished with that and you're feeling good about it, you should try to write a sentence for each one. The absolute change and the relative change. Like, what does it signify? It's the absolute change for 2019 to 2020 for 2-bedroom.
10.
10, good. And I would just make sure to include the units on that, because when we're talking about absolute change, we're talking about the same units as the thing we measured it in, right? The difference is $10. It went up $10. That's the point. Oh, sorry, I'm getting into the sentences. All right, what about the relative change?
It is it 92.5%?
That sounds high because this is a very small change, right? And so I would expect a very low percentage.
Oh well, maybe it
It
could
would
be
say,
9.2%.
I put 0.9%.
Even less, yeah. Right, because if the decimal
you
comes out as
point
0.009, then when I change it over to a percentage, that's going to be 0.9%. Well,
Okay.
0.9, I would just call it 0.9%. About 1%.
So you
Okay,
just
so
move the
as we-
decimal over two
Two
times.
places. That's right. That's how you turn a decimal into a percentage. Now, in terms of making sentences, I encourage you to use this scaffolding. First, start with the qualitative version, which is the price or the FMR of a 2-bedroom apartment. Did what? Did it get higher or go lower?
Increase $10.
Increased, right. And then to make it quantitative, you've already gone there, Karen. We just need to take the same sentence and finish it with some numbers. Increased by $10. That's quantitative version 1.
Do you need to put from 2019 to 2020?
You could, but this is sufficient given the context of the problem. But if you wanted to make it more accurate, you could say between 2019 and 2020. That's a good addition. So to make the other quantitative version of this, I'm going to say almost exactly the same thing, but instead of saying by $10, I'm going to use my other figure, which is what?
0.9%.
0.9%. Right. So this is an easy way to get both of these sentences to sound good. You basically use the same sentence twice, but in one you have the absolute change, and the other one you put the relative change. And you can start it all off with a sentence that is not quantitative. You just start with words. What's happening in this situation? Okay, does that make sense?
Okay, so what if you use the zip code instead of the 2-bedroom? Would that be wrong? You say like the fair market.
Right. It would be wrong. That number, that is a number, but it's not relevant to what we're talking about. We're talking about the price, the fair market rental, and so we need to focus on these numbers, right? That's one thing that's potentially confusing about this problem is there's a lot of numbers flying around, and you got to focus on which ones are relevant. Since we're talking about the change in the price, the only numbers we care about are 1,080 and 1,090.
Okay.
Okay, now let's take it up a notch here, and let's try doing a non-chronological comparison. Okay, so let's go collect the numbers that we need here. One of the scaffoldings that I like is, or you could say old and new. Now, in this situation, there's no timeline except the implicit timeline of him going from this place to this other place. So we can create our own kind of chronological thing, even though we're comparing two numbers out of the same year. So in the 2020 comparison, that's not what I want. Well, I'll just use 2019 because that's one I have up. So 46410 was 1,080 in 46410. This is the FMR for 2-bedroom, and then the other number we need was 46319. Here we go. And in 46319, that's only 890. So 890 in 46319. Okay, so to do the absolute and relative change in this situation, we need to just make sure we're correctly labeling who is the old value and who is the new value. So see if you can use that geographical sense of moving, starting here and finishing here to help you get the numbers in the right place so that you can do the subtraction correctly. One way to check that you've done the subtraction correctly is that an increase should be positive and a decrease should be negative. Okay, need more time?
Not really.
Okay. Yeah, the calculations are pretty straightforward. We're just subtracting and then subtracting and dividing. So who's the new value and who's the old value in this situation?
890.
I'm just going to label them here.
Would the new value be 890 and the old value be
Good.
1080?
Good, that's right. Because I started, or Roderick started in 46,410, so that's the old value, and he went to 46,319, and that's the new value. And that shows that there was a decrease, because if we went from 1080 to 890, that shows that it was going down. The subtraction should reflect that. 890 is the new minus 1080 is the old. That's minus 190. And then the relative change, I'm going to just take the absolute change and divide it by where we started, which was 1080.
17.5.
Good. Changing your relative change to a percentage, I would say 17.5, 17.6, or negative 18% if you want to round to no decimals. Okay, go ahead and try to make a sentence out of that. And again, I encourage you to start with the qualitative version of it. Qualitative just means don't use any numbers at all. Just say what happened in the situation. When Roderick moved from 46,410 to 46,319, what happened to the FMR? And then to make it quantitative, just add on the numbers. I'm going to give you a minute for that. You should practice actually writing the sentences out. Don't say them out loud. Just give everybody a chance to make their sentences. Remember, this is such a big part of the course, just being able to interpret and talk about what we found. Not just do the math, but put words to it.
Okay, wait a minute. On
So
the negative 17.6%. So how you get that?
Yep.
You said negative 90, subtract 890 divided by 1080.
Right. There's two ways to calculate the relative change. I can do it with
Because
new
wouldn't
minus old,
the negative 90 be the new?
890 minus 1080. And then I divide it by where we started. Where did we start? The old value. Should be 1080. I'm not dividing by the new value. I'm dividing by the old value. And Roger started in 46,410. So that's 1080 as your denominator. That's your old value. Okay, so to finish the qualitative part of this, and then I'll want to hear from you guys about the quantitative part. I would say something like when Roderick moved from 46,410 to 46,319, the FMR went down. So that is no numbers, just expressing what happened in this situation. So now as I go to make it quantitative, I can bring in either the absolute or the relative change to say that. So I would use the beginning of this sentence, and then I can finish it by just putting on the absolute change. How much did it go down by?
Negative 17.6%.
Okay,
would
I'm
you
not
use the
going to say
negative in
the,
that? Or would you
right, I'm not
subtract
going to say the negative because I've already said that it went down
So you just gonna say
So-
17.6%?
by 17.6%. So that's one option. This is the relative change sentence. And what about the absolute change sentence?
It went down by $190.
Right, it's the same sentence, but just by $190. So I just wanted you to see how similar the sentences are. If you just start with a good qualitative sentence, making the quantitative sentences is not complicated. We just need to get the change in there. Usually using the word by is good. It changed by this much. It went down by this much. It went up by this much. Try not to use the word change because change doesn't give the direction of the change. Went down, went up, increased, decreased, those kinds of things. So I like to bring in FMR because I think a lot of people haven't heard of it. And if you are renting, which can be a good option when you're trying to save money and you want the flexibility of not being stuck in one place. It's good to know, relative to other places, am I spending more or less? And unless you've gone out and done a lot of searching, it can be hard to kind of figure that out. So the FMR gives you a way, a government agency that has gone out and done all the work for you, and you can compare, you like this apartment or you're staying in this apartment, how does that compare to my zip code? Am I paying more or less? If you're paying more, maybe it's because you just have a nicer apartment, or maybe it's because your landlord is trying to rip you off or something. I don't know. If you're paying less, maybe it's because you live in a crap hole, or maybe it's because you know the person and they're giving you a good deal. But it just gives you a way to kind of think about whether you're getting a good deal or a bad deal relative to the rest of the zip code. That makes sense?
Yeah, but why is it that you use the zip code on this one instead of the 2-bedroom? Because you basically talking about from one area to the next area.
Right. But I'm not using the zip codes as numbers that I'm doing a calculation on. Zip codes are just geographical areas. So I'm saying he went from here to here, and when we look at the FMR table, it organizes everything by zip code. So that's where I got these numbers from. but I'm
So it's
still
like,
focused on what happened to the price as I went,
From one
as
area
a person
to the
goes
next
from
area.
one zip code to another.
Okay, because I know the first one, it
Right.
had 2 bedrooms. We didn't use the zip codes. So that's why I was like, on this question, you use the zip codes. Is it because he moved from one area to the next area?
Right. The first comparison was chronological. So we went from 2019 to 2020. In that case, it's easy to see which is the new and which is the old. In this example, there's no chronology. It's not talking about what happened in 2019 and what happened in 2020. It's just saying he went from one place to another. And you're going to get this kind of problem where you're asked to compare something, but there's no timeline. And so to do that problem, it's the same calculation. We're still using absolute and relative change. And here we can figure out the new and the old by thinking about the situation. He started here, he went there. That's who's new and who's old.
Okay.
Let me give you another example of a problem where the new and the old is really arbitrary. If I am comparing a new iPhone to the new Samsung, and the iPhone is, I have no idea how much a new iPhone is. Let's find out. What is the newest iPhone? iPhone 11?
Say it's about $699.
Well, it depends on the price and the case, and not the case. The you know, a lot of times. Oh,
Gigabyte.
that's pretty good. $699. Yeah, how many gigabytes? A lot of times it depends on the contracts, and that's a whole other thing for us to talk about. But let's say that's $700. The iPhone is $700, and the Samsung Galaxy, what is it, S10? Is that the most recent one? Or is it, what the heck is this, S20? Is that a real thing? Okay, fine, $750. And the Samsung is $750. Make a relative change statement to compare them. So this is kind of an example of a question you might see on a test. And you'll notice that, oh, that was a mistake. You'll notice that, my sentence back. There's no chronology, and I didn't like start with an iPhone and then buy a Samsung, or start with a Samsung and then buy an iPhone. So I get to decide. So in that case, I would just make a little new old table and just pick which number you're going to put where. So go ahead and make a choice, and then we'll all do it together. So somebody want to pick who's going to be new and who's going to be old?
Well, I say since you could comparing the iPhone to the Samsung is old and the iPhone is new.
Okay. That's fine. And there's not a right answer. That's what I mean by arbitrary. It could go either way. So now we can do our absolute change calculation. We can do our relative change calculation. And then we want to try to come up with sentences. And the sentence we're most interested in is the relative change. So we can kind of skip over the absolute change sentence. But again, I would start with the qualitative version of it and then get to the quantitative version by just adding on the figure that I calculated. So I'll give you a little bit of time to work on that. We've decided that the new is 700 and the old is 750. We want to find the absolute relative change, and then we want to make two sentences. The absolute change be, what would the relative change be?
Absolute is -50.
Very good. And that makes relative
negative
0.6%.
6.7.
All year round.
So we're doing -50 divided by 750, right? And then we have a choice to make there because there's a lot of extra sixes. But again, if I turn this into a percent, that's okay. If you want to give it a 0.1%, that's okay. 6.6% is not wrong. It's just not as good of an answer as 6.7%,
Because you round.
because the next
Yeah.
number is a 6, right? Okay, so now try to make the qualitative sentence. Keep in mind these are both negative numbers, so this thing we're comparing should be a decrease or less than or something like that. So how would you say this? Not with any numbers, just comparing the two phones.
You want us to give you an answer? Or just,
Yeah, a qualitative sentence, a sentence without any numbers, but it compares the two phones' price.
when compared, oh, should I give you the answer or just,
Yeah, go for it. What do you got?
I was going to say when comparing the iPhone to Samsung, the relative change decreased. Oh,
Yeah, don't use the relative change in this
the
sentence.
price
I just want to
decreased.
compare the two phones.
Oh, okay.
So
it's
yeah,
the relative price. I could just say the price.
what would you say about the price?
Decrease.
Decreased
Okay,
by,
decrease.
I said iPhone versus Samsung, you decrease.
Okay, how about the iPhone costs less than the Samsung?
Yes.
I mean, the problem with decrease is it implies that we started somewhere and then we went somewhere else, which isn't
Okay.
really what happened here. We're just comparing the two things. Like you could say, if I was going to buy the Samsung and then I decided to buy the iPhone, I would be spending less money,
Bad.
something
Okay.
like that. Okay, so now to make it quantitative, you can just take your 6.7% and stick it in the middle of the sentence
And say the
because it
iPhone
costs less.
less.
Yeah, exactly. The iPhone costs 6.7% less
less.
Than a Samsung.
than the Samsung. That's it. That's the whole sentence. Okay, so that's the basic concept of absolute relative change and also trying to construct a sentence that communicates what's happening. Starting from a situation where, you know, we have a number for 1 year, then we have a number for another year. That's kind of an easier one. Then we looked at a geographical one where we didn't have any years, but we still had kind of a sense of timing. And then this final question where there's really no time and it's arbitrary, which one is the new and which one is the old. If you just make a choice and then follow through, you come up with a good sentence.
So if we have a question like that on the test, we pick and choose which one is old and which one is new.
Right.
Wow.
There's another sentence out there where I did it the other way around, where I made the iPhone the old one and the Samsung the new one. Then it was actually more, and then my relative change is a slightly different number because I'm using a different old value. And if you want to see that, you're welcome to hang around or send me a text or try to do it on your own and come up with the sentence. But you don't have to come up with two sentences. All you got to do is come up with one sentence. So you just pick the one that makes the most sense to you and go with it.